Thank you very much for this invitation to speak a little about the Oxford Archive. I'll talk about the anniversary exhibition, Tutankhamun, Excavating the Archive, co-curated with Daniela Rosenau. This exhibition was based on items chosen by the Griffith Institute staff, and Marianne Eaton-Krauss very kindly acted as our specialist consultant. The project drew extensively, of course, on the research of other scholars, such as that of the historian of photography, Christina Riggs. And I must point out that I was only involved because of my past curatorial and publication work. And so I speak simply from my experience of curating this event on behalf of the Griffith Institute, in an impressionistic overview of the stereotypes that came into play when discussing the narrative of the exhibition. There was no initial survey of visitor expectations, so this is an anecdotal and intuitive approach to the contemporaneous and contemporary narratives. I sketched the ideas that went into developing the presentation and the issues that we hoped to address, but I can claim no authority on this topic and can only act as a prologue to the specialists who will speak later with much more authority. I may as well begin with the epigraph of the publication. The objects lay quiet for thousands of years, many of them in tombs where love or superstition had placed them. On the 7th of May, 1920, the English novelist E.M. Forster published a review of Wallis Budge's memoirs, later republished as an essay for the museum's sake in Abinger Harvest of 1936. Budge, of course, had expanded and curated the Egyptian and Assyrian collections of the British Museum, and he was hugely influential for Egypt's public reception in the early 20th century, despite being a deeply problematic figure. Forster perceptively noted that there is something of the Renaissance desperado about him, with his yarns. And he was highly critical of Budge's nationalistic attitudes, saying that the book leaves an impression of vulgarity at the close. The dreariness and snobbery of the museum business come out strongly beneath this tale of daring do. Now, this is one example of the reception of Egyptology, but although reception studies are often treated as something distinct from the history of academic Egyptology, they are arguably integral to the discipline's self-awareness. This cultural context is, of course, what has framed the rediscovery of Tutankhamun and the creation of the Oxford Archive. Now, in my own research, when charting the popular reception of The Tale of Sinuhe, I realized that certain popular themes in its reception ran parallel to the concerns of contemporaneous academic philology to a remarkable degree. Popular literature provided an interpretative framework for the academic approaches. Already in 1895, one reviewer of Flinders Petrie's Egyptian Tales said that the adventures of Sinuhe remind the reader somewhat of Mr. Rider Haggard's ingenious African romances, exactly the sort of yarns that Forster alluded to in denouncing Wallis Budge. Sir Rider Haggard wrote adventure novels which drew on his experience as an imperial administrator in Africa. Such popular narratives often articulated colonialist, nationalist, and occult tropes, as you can sense a little from this much later film version of his She. And the Australian writer Guy Boothby went even further and rewrote Sinuhe into a sensationalist tale of reincarnation, a professor of Egyptology. And these are names that will resurface in the Tutankhamun archive. Nationalism, so hated by Forster, was of course very much an issue in 2022, as seen in the anniversary celebrations of the European decipherment of hieroglyphs, that foundation myth of European Egyptology. In Forster's account of Europe's interest in antiquities, the Renaissance's imaginative engagement with the past gave way to what he termed the interest of a new purchaser, the modern European nation. National possessions, they were now called, and it was important that they should outnumber the objects possessed by other nations. An object may not be on display, but we have it, which is what matters. It would be humiliating to think it was on exhibit in Cairo. Very perceptive. As Forster wrote, Egypt was moving towards independence. He was very much engaged with this since he had an Egyptian lover. The rediscovery of Tutankhamun has, of course, provided another foundation myth for modern Egyptology, and on a personal level, Egyptologists often cite it and the subsequent exhibitions as inspiring their own careers. The initial representation of the rediscovery was shaped by contemporaneous European stereotypes, not only of Egypt, but also class, race, and gender, that can be seen more easily, more clearly, in contemporaneous fiction about Egypt. One example from the same period as the rediscovery was written by Sax Rohmer. His Brood of the Witch Queen of 1918 is closely contemporaneous with Forster's Review of Budge, and it's a standard pulp fair tale of Oxford Egyptological student life, so I'm quite fond of it. The hero is the masculine Robert Cairn, a tall, thin Scotsman, clean-shaven, square-jawed, and with the crisp light hair and grey eyes, which often bespeak unusual virility. The villain is Anthony Ferrara, the reborn child of Egypt's ancient witch queen, who is a well-attested Orientalist stereotype. The almond-shaped eyes, black as night, gleamed strangely. In his whole appearance there was something repellently effeminate. The novel draws ostentatiously on ancient Egyptian literary and funerary texts, but despite such historical details, it is full of sinister Orientalism. Lotuses that sap the virgin heroine's life as they flower, human sacrifice in the Medum Pyramid, and even an elemental thing consistently capitalized. In the end, of course, the modern masculine British hero destroys both the occult book and the queer Ferrara, ensuring that the sensuous dangers of the ancient East are rendered, in the novel's final word, extinct. The choice of word affirms the triumphant incompatibility of the modern and ancient cultures. And after the rediscovery of the tomb, in September 1923, the novel was republished in Munsey's magazine with a more obviously Egyptian title, It Came Out of Egypt, a series of 6 mysteries from the land of the Nile, presumably in order to cash in on the discovery. In this cultural context, the occult was an integral part of Egypt for most people. The infamous Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn had links to professional Egyptology, including Battiscombe Gunn, who'd acted as a consultant for Aleister Crowley in his youth. Gunn turned his back on the occult by the 1930s when he was elected to the Oxford chair, and for this he was cursed through a medium by an ancient princess for having doubted the accuracy of her grammar. The distinction between academic science and the popular and occult receptions has always been permeable. One item in the Oxford Tutankhamun archive shows how occult attention on the tomb preceded Carnarvon's death, and this has been showcased in a minor way in the final display cases of the exhibition. On the 13th of January 1923, an anonymous telegram was sent from Dublin to Carter, Tutankhamun, Thebes, warning that if trouble continues, reseal tomb, pour milk, oil, wine at threshold. It was probably inspired by a newspaper report on the previous day that a dust storm had halted work at the tomb. The sender was almost certainly Ella Young, an Irish poet and Celtic mythologist, who later wrote letters claiming that Carnarvon had died because the tomb of Tutankhamun was opened without any ceremonies calculated to placate any car or cars that might be in the sepulchre. But this first warning was sent months before Carnarvon's death in April. If a not entirely unexpected dust storm in a desert valley can be taken as a sign of the occult at work, the death of an aristocrat will surely have further repercussions. And the reaction was, of course, swift. For example, on the 20th of May 1923, the Sunday Times significantly cited the opinions of popular writers with psychic and occult interests. Marie Corelli's poison theory. Conan Doyle puts suspicion on Tutankhamun. Others, including Haggard himself, were dismissive, and another newspaper article noted it is only a novelist's fancy. And then later, in 1929, there is fine material for a romancer of the type of the late Guy Boothby or Sir Rider Haggard, in the record of death which has pursued the participators in the opening and exploration of Tutankhamun's tomb. The role of fiction in shaping these narratives was very apparent to contemporaries, and this is an aspect we tried to address in the exhibition, while also trying to move away from stereotypical narratives about the curse. Quite a specific narrative, of course, developed. The death was claimed to be the fulfillment of a curse written on an ordinary clay tablet over the entrance to the tomb. The tablet was supposedly removed by Howard Carter, who denied its existence in order not to hinder the excavation schedule. Conveniently, its very absence from the later official archive thus can be taken as confirming the story of the curse. Already, in 1923, Arthur Weigel had written, possibly disingenuously, "The story has been spread that there was a specific curse written upon a wall of the royal sepulchre." By 1930, the existence of the tablet was so well established that Dr. H.R.H. Hall, keeper of the Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum, authorized the Daily Telegraph to publish the following statement. As to the so-called inscription, "Death shall come on swift wings to him that toucheth the tomb of a pharaoh," no such inscription on the royal or other tombs is known to me or to any Egyptologists. I'll come back to this because these narratives are remarkably persistent. The Oxford Archive has often been presented as an unmediated source of Egyptological data, but it is itself a historical construct that needs to be interrogated. The range of sometimes contradictory material provides potential for research on the formation of the official narratives, which were highly varied, unsurprisingly so, given that the rediscovery was, as Mace said of the opening of the burial chamber, an unforgettable experience and impossible to get onto paper. The archival documents often voice the expected attitudes of the period. Carnarvon enthused in his first letter to Alan Gardner, "There's enough stuff to fill the whole Egyptian section upstairs of the B.M." Carter's initial journal entry described the tomb as a marvelous collection of treasures. And later in the publication, he added the infamous phrase, "Everywhere the glint of gold." The first accounts emphasized the variety of the artifacts, but golden treasures became a motif that dominates the reception, redolent of treasure hunts, adventurers and adventures, and exploitative capitalism. Throughout the planning for the exhibition, I felt we wanted, instead of these narratives, a chronicle no longer gold, in Tennessee Williams's phrase, from the Night of the Iguana. But as well as examining the archive itself, the Bodleian felt we also needed to tell the basic story of the rediscovery for as wide an audience as possible, giving us an impetus to try to stage a more nuanced version of the old familiar story. As with decipherment, narratives have tended to center around a single heroic white male, and the complex process of the 10-year clearance is often imagined as a single moment of discovery, of light entering the darkness. The early narratives shifted slightly in details, revealing how much they were constructed, and Carter's self-mythologizing has been magnificently studied by Eleanor Dobson. In his official publication, Carter wrote of his first glimpse into the tomb that he said, "Yes, wonderful things." But Carter's journal shows that this was not what he originally said that he said, but instead simply, "It is wonderful." The fact that these famous words are almost certainly a later fabrication is extremely well known, but the fabrication persists and has been endlessly repeated this past year, as in the Royal Mail official commemorative stamps. Both Carter's journal and the publication seem overwritten to many modern readers, in the style of a popular novel, although to be fair, I think they do capture a sense of wonder better than some more recent publications. And in this respect, it's worth remembering another anniversary. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land was published in 1922, which reminds us that Carter's style of writing was not the only one at this period. There were alternatives. In the official retellings, of course, there were victims. In the first account, Carter had written, "Lord C, Lady E, and Calendar with the Rices waited in anxious expectation." But later, in the publication, the Egyptians were written out, allowing the English to occupy centre stage, as they do in things like this cigarette card. Now, Dobson has argued that Carter's self-presentation was very much influenced by the pulp novels he'd read as a youth, and his own short story, The Tomb of the Bird, provided another retelling of that famous moment of revelation. It's a highly sensationalist tale about the Canary of Death. It was co-authored by the novelist Percy White, Professor of English History at Cairo. Here, just as the protagonists glimpse into the tomb and realize that a great archaeological triumph was our reward, messengers come with news of the tragedy. which is the death of Carter's canary, killed by a cobra. The story was published just 9 months after Carnarvon died, making it a rather tastelessly trivial idea of tragedy and death. The Egyptians get written back in, but only to react in a suitably superstitious manner to this portent of evil omen. The natives were awed. Percy White also worked on the official publication of the tomb, so the popular and the academic narratives were inextricably entangled. Now, conveniently for exhibition purposes, the story was published in a visually striking form, and all 3 accounts of the first glimpse into the tomb have been included in the exhibition audio guide in both English and Arabic. We have tried to suggest to people how the narratives vary. Another version of that first moment, not included in the exhibition, was provided in a novel published in Britain in 1943 after Carter's death. And Carter's niece, Phyllis Walker, expressed her distaste for this atrocious novel in her correspondence with Percy Newbery about the archive. The novel was by the German Victoria Woolf and translated into English as "And 7 Shall Die." Walker was outraged that it travestied Uncle Howard as Mr. Conway and Lord Carnarvon as Lord Evesham, and especially that she makes Mr. Conway a drinker of much whiskey and a married man who has an affair in the desert with a glamorous blonde secretary. In this romance, the whole discovery and opening of the tomb of Tutankhamun, yes, really, gold everywhere, gleaming, dazzling gold, is overshadowed by the heroine finally meeting Carter Conway's wife and realizing that his wife does not, in fact, really love him. It is appallingly trivial. But it's striking that modern docudramas have continued to absorb the narrative of the discovery into heteronormative romance genres, with Lady Evelyn as the unmarried Carter's love object. Reviews of the series you see here have included A Trowel-Wielding Romp and Down Tomb Abbey. Fictional pulp narratives continue to shape the presentation of the scientific research to a dangerous extent. And I must admit this is one reason that the Oxford exhibition deliberately excluded Lady Evelyn. The self-fashioning that is traceable in Carter's writings is very pervasive, and it's also embodied in the photographic record, so magnificently studied by Riggs. This includes carefully posed shots embodying the actor's ideas and assumptions, and we've displayed 2 shots of the treasury from the same spot in multiple prints. One shows it lit relatively naturally from the burial chamber, and one is a rather Gothic view with hidden light sources. And this, of course, is the image that is still the most reproduced and most requested for reproduction. As we wanted to contextualize the archive historically, we avoided any of the recently colorized photos. They are very vivid and engaging, but as Riggs has written, digital colorization ignores both the material qualities and historical distance of photographs. One priority of the anniversary was to showcase the archive itself in an attempt to provide a new perspective beyond the established stereotypes, and this aim informed the visual design. The poster design and book avoided the stereotypical gold as much as possible, and the keynote colour was a lapis lazuli blue, a very Egyptian colour, but possibly not the one that audiences were expecting. The selected lead image was detailed, like the archival records, with chipped and broken surfaces, showing touches of the real that are so often smoothed out in glossier publications. The tiny olive leaf wreath is something not seen, of course, in modern photos of the coffin, and hopefully it would remind audiences of the actions of the funeral ceremonies, humanizing the events and the artifacts. Our designer, Dr. Little, worked on both book and exhibition, and it's been a huge privilege to work with the Bodleian team who shaped the narratives, choices and storyline as the book was gradually reshaped into an exhibition. The book has 50 items in chronological order and went to press at the end of 2021. The exhibition contained some 150 items, and the space allowed a thematic treatment. The main cases for a narrative about the tomb's discovery and clearance, the island cases for case studies on the archival sources, and then smaller wall cases towards the end on the aftermath, the publicity, and the reception. The display space in the Bodleian was the so-called Treasury Gallery in the Western Library, which is a relatively new space created in 2015, and the exhibition witnessed the gallery's millionth visitor in August of 2022. Fortunately for us, the space is lined with limestone, which was a gift for contextualizing an archive about archaeology in Luxor. The Bodleian team specializes in exhibiting books and archives, so they provided us with an imaginative and varied visual display. The panel texts were also available in Arabic, translated by Hebatala Ibrahim, and an audio guide allowed further voices, including Egyptian ones, to be heard. And the exhibition is now included on Google Street View as a legacy project. The exhibition itself was opened on the 12th of April by Sherif Kamal, the Egyptian ambassador to the UK, and guests included descendants of Carter, Mace, and Lord Carnarvon. There have been a total of 120,000 visitors. Curating an exhibition, as always, leads to new research. As one minor example, this plan of the tomb has usually been dated to 1923 from a caption by Carter himself. But we realized that the niche shown on the plan, and also shown on this photograph, was opened only in 1930. Carter recorded that he opened the niche in the presence of Swedish royalty on the 3rd of November 1930, and so the plan in its finished form must date much later than was previously thought. And during this past year, the Griffith team have published in the Institute's online catalogue a full revision of the existing catalogues for both the Carter manuscripts and the Tutankhamun archive, with a greater level of detail on the accession history of the different sections of the collection. The team is currently working on the digitization of the collection in full-colour high-resolution scanning to ensure both preservation and accessibility. All the new scans will be made freely available online. A planned revision of the Tutankhamun Anatomy of an Excavation website will not only include an upgrading of the databases that support it, but also content updates and interlinking between different groups within the archival collections. So the black and white scans of the journals and diaries will be replaced with colour ones, and the diaries will now include sections that were considered insufficiently linked to the excavation seasons in Egypt for inclusion, such as Carter's North American lecture tour of 1924. The Burton photos and the object cards will be revised to include the different media, so users will be able to access high-resolution digital versions of a specific Burton photograph in all its variants. Scans of the original glass plate negatives, secondary glass or film negatives, scans of original prints, scans of lantern slides, etc. Including this. This famous print of the mask has on its back various annotations by Carter, made in order to help the Illustrated London News produce a colorized version. Revision of the object cards will include updated transcriptions, incorporating deletions, additions, and corrections, and scans of the original photographic prints accompanying the cards. The anniversary has given us a long overdue chance to reassess the state of the archive and to move from regarding it as a source of Egyptological data to a historical artifact in itself. As part of this, consistently, throughout the display, we wanted to signal the colonialist context of the archive. In the first item that the visitor sees, it is immediately clear. We display the colonial diary cover as well as the famous scribbled entry of November the 4th, first steps of tomb found. And again, in this shot by Lord Carnarvon, annotated by Gardner, of the official excavation team at lunch. Unnamed Egyptians serve white Egyptologists, all of them men, in a tomb repurposed as a gentleman's club. In order to gently move the audience towards a post-colonial viewpoint, the Institute's portrait of Carter was deliberately not placed centre stage. That would be far too heroizing. But instead, in a niche and as a reduced-scale reproduction. That image, of course, tells its own story of a middle-class archaeologist trying to pass himself off as an English gentleman. But we wanted to shift the spotlight away from Carter as an individual. So we mentioned, but did not dwell on, his misdemeanors and thefts, which are well documented in the standard biographies. His persistent lies about entering the burial chamber, about removing objects from the tomb. With hindsight, thinking about how these lies potentially compromise the integrity of the archive as a whole, we might have confronted these more explicitly, by including items such as the correspondence between Newbery and Gardner after Carter's death. We were trying to present a balanced overview of the discovery and the records as a whole. But in trying to shift the focus away from Carter himself, I worry that we might seem to have been complicit in a whitewash of his role and the official accounts, which was certainly not our aim. We also wanted to show that the actual official team was in fact slightly, albeit only slightly, more varied than a few heroic or demonic white men. Other marginal figures included Harry Burton's wife Minnie, whose diary was recently acquired by the Institute Archive and who is seen here with the Metropolitan team. This diary, accessible online, reveals daily activities, including her visits to the wonderful tomb. But her activities were on the whole almost as gendered as in Sax Rohmer's novel. But most importantly, the exhibition tried to move the spotlight onto the Egyptian team members. This is scarcely an innovation, but it has been greeted as one by the press, which I think shows how pervasive the usual stereotypes have become and how persistent they are. The exhibition has tried to indicate how partial and limited the British Archive is, rather than comprehensive, authoritative and objective, and how British it is, by noting that the names of the Egyptians seen in the photographs are left unrecorded in the archive and cannot be matched with the images. Now, this approach has been welcomed, but I cannot stress how much other perspectives are essential. And the research into the Egyptian team members by the Egyptian historian Hend Mohammed provides something that the official British Archive simply cannot. In the exhibition, we wanted to speak only for and about that British Archive and not to claim any other authority to speak on others' behalf. But a key aim was to show how partial and how limited that official archive is. 1922 saw a move towards Egyptian independence. After increased restrictions to archaeological work were introduced, Egyptology's self-definition was increasingly framed in terms of specialist knowledge. And here I think Claire Lewis's ongoing work on the institutionalization of Egyptology in British universities is hugely important. The sheer popularity of ancient Egypt following the discovery further increased the subject's need to differentiate itself from popular culture. Already in 1918, Forster had been sceptical about the impact of the past on modern society, asking the ironic question, after all, what is the use of old objects? They breathe their dead words into too dead an ear. It was different in the Renaissance, which did get some stimulus, but our age is industrial. Its interest in the past is mainly faked. The press and public fascination with Tutmania increased this problematic aspect immensely. The ancient Mediterranean got the Italian Renaissance, while ancient Egypt in the early 20th century got things like the Tatum board game. Now, Egyptomania is a complex phenomenon, and one that was showcased in the 2014 Ashmolean exhibition about discovering Tutankhamun. But I think in many ways it has had an intellectually reductive impact on the subject. Egypt was already associated with popularity and accessibility in the earliest displays in the British Museum, as suggested by Stephanie Mosher's studies, and as can be seen in Forster's novel Morris, where the working-class hero can react to Oriental objects, but is alienated by classical culture, which is too heavily implicated in the British class system and normativity. After Tutankhamun, representations of Egypt seem to have been shaped in more popular forms to an even greater extent. And I think this change can be sensed in two buildings in Oregon from the pre- and post-Tutankhamun eras. The elegant Abbey Hope Mausoleum of 1914, compared with the 1929 Balsinger Ford car showroom in nearby Klamath Falls, in a style much more reminiscent of contemporaneous cinema architecture. And it's noticeable that contemporaneous British literary writers avoided Egypt. There are comparatively few direct echoes of ancient Egypt in, say, the secular Bloomsbury Circle, as opposed to popular novels. One allusion to the discovery and curse narrative in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse of 1927 is significantly covert and inexplicit. The heroine Lily Briscoe imagines how in the chambers of the mind and heart of the woman was stood like treasures in the tombs of kings, tablets bearing sacred inscriptions, which, if one could spell them out, would teach one everything, but they would never be offered openly, never made public. Egypt is largely unmentioned, or mocked, as in Eliot's Wasteland, just as Forster wrote out his Egyptian experiences from his novels, and I've argued elsewhere that for such writers ancient Egypt was simply too entangled with colonialist politics, popular yarns, occultism, and the vulgarity of Egyptology. In sharp contrast, we can compare the poet Ahmed Shawki, who we know now was a friend of the Egyptian medic involved in the examination of Tutankhamun's body. He wrote several poems about Tutankhamun, celebrating the ancient object's ability to evoke the king's world and linking the discovery and the rebirth of the king with Egypt's identity as a nation, which was starting to free itself from colonial oppression. Tutankhamun has returned his authority to our sons. Of course, he does not feature in the British Oxford Archive, but the audio guide allowed us to include his voice in the exhibition. In the archive, however, personal reactions can be extremely touching, even in the context of popular culture. The collection includes letters that Carter received, and we displayed this very visually appealing one to Carter from a 6-year-old Irish boy who wanted to be an Egyptologist like you. Luke Dillon Mahan in the end studied painting and became a notable artist with a career in advertising. It's clear that the wonder of the original artifacts is always able to escape the constraints of the popular stereotypes on an individual level. As a personal example, my art teacher father could remember the publicity from the end of the excavation in the 1930s, and I suspect that's why he first trained as a photographer. As Riggs has perceptively said, stories about Tutankhamun should feature death and loss, not just legends of gold. And this drawing by my father is very much about that for me. In the 1970s, my father, remembering his own childhood enthusiasm, taught me measured perspective using the tomb as an example, and the drawing entered the Griffith Institute archive after it had been used in some of the Institute's Tutankhamun publications. And as a boy, he'd read Sax Roma and Haggard too, as I did. Through the diversity and intensity of such individual interactions, the impact of the discovery has had hugely varied impacts on world culture. However, we've kept realizing that reactions to the discovery are not only personal and spontaneous, but commercialized. Carnarvon's exclusive press deal was an ominous portent, and the sheer extent of its reach ensured that it embedded the British narrative globally. People can still apparently feel that Egypt is their culture, and such a sense of ownership is often passionately felt. One reviewer of the Bodleian book gave it up in disgust and returned it to publishers as it was too woke, noting, "I'm not giving up my Tut pencils or beach blanket." And I must admit I've had some extraordinary and abusive emails this past year. An enthusiastic attachment to the past sometimes comes with a lack of critical distance, reinforcing the dangerous sense of the exceptionalism of Egyptian culture and of Egyptology. For the exhibition book, we tried to encourage diverse responses by including some less familiar examples of Egyptian reception, such as this painting by the Luxor-based artist Ala Ahwat, and also a shot from a recent production of Philip Glass's Akhenaten showing the coronation of Tutankhamun. The events programme reflected this aim with a visit by that production's star, the countertenor Anthony Roth Costanzo, hopefully suggesting how the archive can still be an inspiration beyond Egyptology and beyond Egyptomania. The commercial and popular pressures on Egyptology's self-presentation are hard to combat. Stereotypes are quick for the media to research, and they guarantee easy audiences and a secure return for financial investment. The Bodleian was thankfully free from such constraints due to the small size of the exhibition space and its deep commitment to free access. The museum professional is aware of how difficult such negotiations almost always are. The Oxford exhibition texts are very explicit that, quote, "there is more than gold to Tutankhamun." But this experience of curation has taught me that no matter how hard you try, the hero and the bloody gold keep creeping back in. For the German edition, the archive was displaced from the title, and instead we have, again, Howard Carter, and a little bit more gold. And then again, here, is the Chinese edition, and how often people use weird Orientalistic fonts when presenting Egypt. And it's hard to free oneself from these inherited colonialist assumptions. In writing the exhibition texts, it was so easy for us to refer to the nameless, the unnamed Egyptians, thinking that we were being inclusive. But of course, they were not nameless. It was simply that their names were unrecorded by the British. So even in the odd slips of phrasing, it's so easy to be subsumed into these established stereotypes unthinkingly. Inquiries about the exhibition echoed the same stereotypes, not only about the curse, but that research is always about making discoveries. The importance of a nuanced, holistic, deep analysis of the realities of research and fieldwork seem hard to communicate. Even stories saying there is no curse have to be about the curse. As well as commercial aspects, heritage itself can be a dangerous construct. As David Lowenthal has remarked, such pasts made usable by partisan manipulation are heritage as opposed to more widely agreed history. History is for all, heritage for us alone. Heritage has its profits, and Tutankhamun is often regarded as a cash crop. And last year, I think there was a bit of a golden heritage bandwagon, often celebrating what has been rather unkindly called the Downton Abbey School of Archaeology. Not only does the ancient East offer an escapist, exotic world for viewers, but so, it seems, does the academic discipline. The archive's images summon up for some viewers a golden retro age of Egyptology, reinforcing those pulp fiction stereotypes that irritated Forster and that have shaped the old but still apparently profitable franchises of Indiana Jones, The Mummy, Lara Croft, those stereotypes which live on in the outrageous self-presentation of some American academics with what has been termed their colonialist cosplay. And some works of academic history fail to challenge these views, such as A World Beneath the Sand, Adventurers and Archaeologists in the Golden Age of Egyptology. Why is it always golden? A book that is dedicated to the memory of Wallis Budge. Again, Wallis Budge. And as any university academic knows, these stereotypes of imperial pulp fiction are still surprisingly pervasive in university applications for the subject. Such perspectives are not restricted to the former American or European colonial powers, of course. Nationalism exists within any country, and heritage is always defined for commercial ends as a resource for international tourism. In 2021, Egypt itself staged the Pharaoh's Golden Parade. Gold again. As the historian Hussein Omar has noted, this was another example of these royal bodies being deployed for political display. But Britain has, of course, done exactly the same quite recently, so I am not someone who can criticize. What I would say is that such commercialized views of ancient Egypt are not the only option, just as Carter's prose style was not the only possibility in the 1920s. Shadi Abdel Salam's film Al-Mumia contains a version of the same mummies passing in procession. Its simplicity and style, no gold, has for me a visual poetry that I find immensely moving and poetic. It's a film that is much admired by James Ivory, the dedicatee of the exhibition's book. Engaged works of art such as this show that the commercial stereotypes are not inevitable or irresistible. As one example of alternative possibilities that's ongoing, the Egyptian soprano Fatma Said is currently working with the Oxford composer James Whitburn on a set of Egyptian love songs chosen from Papyrus Harris to echo the flowers and wreaths from the tomb. As the composer notes, there are intentional stylistic references to the musical language of English composers writing in the 1920s and those who influenced them, blended with the tonality informed by the two ancient Egyptian trumpets, and also using replica sistra recreated from the archive records. Something deeply Egyptian, but also international. In connection with this, to mark the 4th of November, we held a small commemorative ceremony with the sistra and a replica of the olive leaf wreath that was made by a local florist in memory of the young king and all those who worked on the tomb, ancient and modern, Egyptian and other. No celebration, but just a pause for memory and commemoration. The writer and commentator Ardaf Suwaif placed the wreath and later wrote about it to her nephew, the political prisoner Ala Abdel al-Fattah. The continuing pervasive entanglement of modern Egyptology with toxic stereotypes and paradigms makes the discipline pretty much a curse in itself. What then can one do or say? An ethical personal choice faces every academic, as E.M. Forster implied in his writings. And here, optimistically, I think that the sheer diversity and professional fragmentation of Egyptology offers immense potential to challenge these narratives. As my predecessor John Baines asserts, Egyptology is not a discipline in itself, but an example of area studies. And we can see this glimpse of hope already in this archival image. Carter's team were all white males, but they were at least a varied group of specialists, reflecting the remarkable range of materials preserved in the tomb. The use of comparative theory, cross-disciplinary studies, and archaeological techniques over the past generation of Egyptologists offers an inspiring model for a way forward, less intellectually isolationist, less exceptional, less nationalistic than the old stories. And hopefully also less of a capitalist bandwagon, though of course new inequalities are continually asserting themselves. This all leaves us as professional academics with a huge responsibility to try to convey what the study of ancient Egypt can be about. And it can be done. I think here of Projectu Jehuti, which is funerary archaeology as imperial Thebes, but is presented with both flair and with academic integrity. We can work together in search of common but distinctive human histories, celebrating difference without orientalizing it. In the words of the historian of sexuality, Geoffrey Weeks, trying as best we can to make contact across time and place with other lives and other values. We need to acknowledge that we are different and yet can still find moments of identification that highlight our common human aspirations across the chasm of time, making the connection, the human gesture across time and space. Literary studies can contribute to the ideal of empathy, an ideal that was common in the early 20th century, but perhaps not so much in the modern academic ethos. Forster said of his Egyptian lover, "I felt we belonged to each other. You had made me an Egyptian." A few decades later, Margaret Yourcenar famously evoked the power of imaginative empathy in Memoirs d'Adrien, one of the few very great novels set in ancient Egypt. In the Oxford Archive, this image of the marks of an ancient hand in a pot of ointment is especially striking, and it can prompt an immediate fellow feeling across cultures and millennia, and evoke quite literally the touch of the real. It provides a palpable reminder of the reality of ancient people, as do the ancient mistakes, the slips, and the alterations that were made when installing the burial in the tomb. That immediacy is perhaps, however, too easy a consolation. The tempting dream of human life as unchanging can deny cultural difference. Better and more complex images are available, present in a series of shots of a boy wearing a pectoral from the tomb. For modern eyes, these photographs are very evocative images of the worlds of the living and the dead, literally touching each other. But as Riggs has noted, the images have complications from the modern stories in which various individuals have claimed to be the boy, and the myth that a water boy first discovered the tomb. When first published in the Illustrated London News in April 1927, the photograph was described as having been taken simply to show the method of suspension of the pectoral. Here, the historical record reveals its partiality, and there is no known record of the boy's identity in the archive. The shots remain very much Americo-European views of both modern and ancient Egypt. But this was the image we chose from the very first moment of planning to be centre stage on the main axis of the gallery, instead of Carter. The boy's untroubled human response to the weight of his history and heritage. Any close look at the archive will reveal how messy and muddled the events were, and how we are all deeply complicit in the forces that created this vision. That is no surprise. But these images can perhaps also serve as a reminder that, as well as empathy, we need humility and self-awareness, especially when we are outsiders, if we are ever to get beyond the stereotypical yarns about what Forster termed the sumptuous and exotic country of Egypt. As he noted shortly before the rediscovery, it is doubtful whether such an Egypt ever existed. O fantastic and extraordinary land, where art thou? Where art thou? Indeed, after 100 years, it's about time we all grew up and put these reductive and immature stories behind us. After all, there are much more interesting and much more wonderful stories for us to tell together.